Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Via Nebula. In this game, all the players are living in a fog-enshrouded world where they are trying to rebuild their civilization by getting these buildings built. In order to do that, you have to move resources from one area all the way over to the building site, but these paths are shrouded with fog, so you're going to have to clear the fog from those spaces, but once you do that, everyone else will also be able to move resources along those paths. Pretty much everything you do in this game is going to help your opponents out as well. That's kind of the main thing that's going on here. First, I'll show you how the game plays, and then I'll jump into my review. Here's what the board could look like at the beginning of a 3-player game. First of all, there are 2 different boards. There's this one and then one on the flip side. This is the beginner style, and on the back side there are more of these petrified forest locations, which I'll explain in a little bit. And then we have all these exploitation tiles, which have been randomized out and then plunked down in all the meadow spots on the board. Within that stack of exploitation tiles, we also had these, which seeded the board with starting resources. However, one of these was randomly not used. In this case, it was the wooden one. And as you'll notice, they have 5s up here, but down on the bottom, it says in a 2- and 3-player game, you put 4 resources out on the board, which is why we have these resources in these spots. Everybody starts with 2 of these hidden contract cards, which are essentially, they're similar to the main contract cards, which I'll show you in just a minute, but only we know about them. They have some special text at the bottom, which we can evaluate if they get built, and these are the resources that it takes to actually build these, but I'll explain that in just a little bit. On each player's turn, they will take 2 actions, as noted by these 2 symbols on their player board. You can choose from one of these 6 action options for each of those actions, all of which only take 1 action to use, except for this one right here, which takes 2. So let's go through these in order. The first one is we can evaluate an exploitation tile by taking one of our craftsmen here and putting them out onto the board. The player can evaluate any of these exploitation tiles out on the board. It doesn't really matter where they are. And so for instance, if they took this one, they would then put their craftsman down and they would look to the tile. In a 4-player game, they put 4 resources down, and then in a 2- or 3-player game, they would put 3. Since this is a 3-player game, they would put those 3 wheat down, and these wheat are now available for any players to grab and put into their building sites, which I'll show in just a second. You'll also note this number on the bottom of the exploitation tile. This is the number of victory points that the player gets for taking this tile, so black just made 2 points. The next action option lets them take one of their building sites and put it out on the board. If this was a 2-player game, they would put the full hexagon version, but since it's the 3 or 4, they put this one down. They can place this down in any one of these ruined sites on the board, and it does not matter what section of the hexagon they're specifically in, and it's also important to note that other players can share that same spot by putting their building site down there, or a player could, if they get there first, put 2 of their own building sites into a specific spot. The third action option lets them take one of these clearing tiles, and they get to clear some fog out on the board. With this action, this clear meadow tile can only be placed on these cloud spots that don't have the petrified forest trees on them. Also, it must be placed next to one of the spots that has a player piece of the color of the person who's playing or is adjacent to another one of these clear spots. So at the beginning of the game, this would have to go here, here, or here next to this spot, or they could also put it down here or here because those would be adjacent to this craftsman. However, at some point in the future, another player could take this one and put it over here, even though they might not be adjacent to one of their color because it is adjacent to a clear meadow. So let's say that they put it right here. Next up, we have the only action in the game that actually costs 2 actions to use, and that is just like the one we just did, except it allows you to cover up those petrified forest locations. Now we have the transport goods action. This allows a player to pick up 1 resource from the board and then transport it along a path of completely clear meadow tiles all the way over to one of their building sites. In this case, it's nice and easy, it's just 1 jump. However, the distance doesn't matter, so if later in the game all of these tiles had been cleared, for 1 action they could potentially have taken this stone from over here and traveled all the way over here to put it down onto this site. It's important to note that you're not allowed to cross one of these sites that already has resources. You can only move resources through completely clear meadows, so this exploitation tile as well as these resources would involve blockers that would stop the transport of goods. And now for the last action option, which is going to allow us to fulfill a contract and put one of our building tokens out on the board. Once again, each player starts with 2 hidden contracts in their hand, but there are also always 4 face-up contracts in the middle of the table and a deck of new contracts that will fill these spots once these are taken. As I mentioned before, the resources along the top of all of these cards are going to tell you what it's going to cost in order to actually complete that contract and take the card. So let's say that the black player's building site looked like this, and they've decided they want to build one of their hidden contracts from their hand. Now, you'll notice that they can actually build both of these because the common denominator here is stone and wheat, and then there's also a wood and a brick over here. They are looking at both of these and they see the secret plan would get them 3 victory points and allow them to draw the top card from that open contracts deck and keep it as another secret contract. And this other one says shortcut. It's also 3 victory points, and it lets them discard 2 of their meadow tiles from their player board right off their player board. So let's go ahead and say that they're going to build this shortcut. Now they are allowed to do this even though there are more resources on this spot than are on this the top of the card. They're going to remove all the resources from this site, and then they remove the building site itself. They replace it with their building marker, so that goes right there on the board. And again, since you can have 2 building sites on a spot, there can be 2 different buildings on a given hexagon. Their building site comes back to their board so they can use it again, and now they discard all of the resources except for any that were surplus. So we needed all 3 of these, so they go back to the box, but they did not need this brick, so it instead goes over here to their warehouse, and you'll notice this -1 victory point token. This means that at the end of the game, every single resource in this area is going to be worth -1 point to that player, so it definitely pays to be efficient and not over resource on spots when you build these buildings. Lastly, we evaluate the text on the bottom of this building. So the shortcut says we remove 2 of these meadow tiles. So when we take these off the board, we'll actually notice that these are the last 2 for this player. And we see down here, we get another 2 victory points. So this is a bonus for clearing lots of meadows on the board, essentially. The more of these meadow tiles you clear off, the more victory points you get, although it's always 2 points under all of these stacks. It doesn't matter how many you get down. The game end is triggered once one player has built all 5 of their buildings. They're going to take this end of game card, and you'll see that it's worth 2 victory points to them, and then down on the bottom it says that all other players are going to take 1 additional turn. Once everyone has taken their final turns, each player is going to have to look around the board and take any penalty resources that are still available. Now these are going to be any resources that are still on any of their building sites, as well as any resources that are on any exploitation sites with their craftsmen that were never taken off. All of these resources are going to be put down into the warehouse section of their player board, and they'll be worth -1 point at the end of the game. And now everybody adds up all their victory points. They're going to get points for these revealed adventurers. They might have points if they were the person to end the game. They get points for these exploitation tiles they've taken throughout the game. And then of course the points on their contracts that they've completed. Some of the contracts, like this one, well, very few of them have a question mark here. This one right here says they get 1 point for each of the exploitation tiles that they've taken. So this contract right here is actually going to be worth 4 victory points. And when I add all that together, they have 26 points, but then they have to subtract 1 for every single resource over here. So they have 2 over there. That means their final score is 24, and whoever has the most points is going to be the winner. Let's now begin the review for Via Nebula, and we'll start with a few positive points. The first of these relates to what I think is the most interesting aspect of the game in general, and that is how you are forced into and incentivized into helping your opponents while you are taking your turns. In many games, you can potentially help out your opponents, but in this one, it seems like it's a central design conceit in order to have you do things that help your opponents out. And you really need to figure out how you can help yourself out a little bit more than them when it's your turn. If it's clearing those fog spaces on the board, you have the incentive of clearing lots of them so that you reveal the victory points of the explorers underneath those different stacks, and you get 2 points for doing that. And when a winning score is usually in the low to mid 20s, 2 points is a pretty significant amount. You figure you're going to clear this path for yourself, and your opponents might use it, but you're going to try to clear that path in such a way that it's convenient for you but not convenient for your opponents. It's kind of an interesting way of doing that, but at the end of the day, since they're all hexagons, even if it's a little less convenient for opponents, they are still probably going to be happy if you do it. And many turns evaluate where one person clears a spot and the next person goes, "Oh, thank goodness. All right, I'm so glad you did that because now I can do this, that, and the other thing." And of course, the person who just took their turn is maybe going to be a little bummed because they were trying to dodge that. But especially if you're playing 3 or 4 player game, there's just no way you're not going to be actively helping out somebody around the table. And when it comes to incentivization, I think it's very interesting the way you throw your craftsman down on the board in order to exploit those tiles. You pull that token off and you get a couple points, so it depends on what kind of tile it is, and then you put the resources down on the board that everybody can use. And in this case, you almost want to intentionally help out your opponents because you figure if that exploitation tile spot is in a lucrative position, then somebody's going to get there and somebody's going to get those victory points, so it may as well be you. And then once those resources are on the board, you want everybody to go in and grab them because you only have 2 of these craftsmen, and you want to be able to keep going around and exploiting these sites to get these resources, especially considering if you get stuck at the end of the game with a craftsman on a spot with resources, those are going to be negative points. So It's pretty cool. With the fog, you are trying to help everybody out as little as possible, even though it's going to happen. And with the exploitation, you want to help people out as much as you can so you get the victory points for it, so you can keep on putting more craftsmen out to exploit sites. So it's just a very cool design idea woven into this game, and it makes the turns quite interesting. Positive number 2 relates to how quickly you can start playing this game, because the rules almost teach themselves. They're very quick to get through, and they're pretty self-explanatory too. You have this player mat in front of you. It shows you the 6 action options that you have available to you, which might sound like a lot until you realize how simple these action options are. Like, they're just like, take this and put it out on the board. Okay, you're done. And that applies to several of them, whether it be a craftsman or a building site or a fog tile. And, oh man, it's almost fun to teach this game. And I don't mind teaching games, but it's just nice to have this one where you finish teaching the game in way under 10 minutes, and almost every time I've taught it, I've had someone be like, oh, okay, well, I guess let's start. That was quick. And I've never seen anybody be confused when we actually started the game as to what they're really supposed to be doing. And part of that is because it's a light to medium weight Euro game, but part of that is also a testament to the elegance of the rule set. There aren't caveats all over the place, like, you do this always except when this and that happens. And no, you have to make sure you don't forget that because this is over there, then this is going to happen. You don't have really any of those things going on in this rule set, and I just really appreciate it from a rules teaching perspective and from a rules understanding perspective. Positive number 3 is a bit of a branch off from number 2 in that it also relates to time, but specifically I want to talk about how short the turns are and how short the game in general is because of that. Specifically, when talking about the turns, I feel like about 80% of turns in this game are about 20 seconds or less. Sometimes even like 8-second turns where people just put 2 fog tokens down and that's it. Their turn is over. And then about 20% of the time, I have found that I can take kind of a long term that might go 1 or 2 minutes, maybe later than that, longer than that, very rarely, because I'm a bit locked down trying to figure out a turn that's going to help me more than my opponents. And part of that is because you have the 2 actions and you have these 6 options, so there is a good variety of things that you can do, and usually those longer turns happen late in the game when the board is covered in routes, so pretty much anything you uncover is going to unlock something for somebody else, but also when you're really close to the end of the game, you're trying to mitigate all the negative points that you might have out on the board. But in general, when I average those 2 things out, when you have like a bunch of 10 to 20 second turns, and then 1 or 2, or very rare anyway, 1 to 2 minute turns, these turns are very quick. And it means that many times I've been playing the game, and suddenly it's my turn again. I took my turn, and like 30 or 40 seconds later, it's my turn again, and I haven't even figured out what I want to do yet. Or I have, and I take my turn real quick, and it's almost like a game of hot potato, as people just take quick turns until it finally stops on somebody who like, ooh, actually has to think about it for a bit. And because the turns are quick, this game is pretty quick. Pretty much every game of it has gone 50 to maybe 70 minutes on the slightly long end. It's just a quick game, and it is a bit of a light to medium game style Euro game anyway, and I just think that it ends at the right time. It is a satisfying experience. I feel like at the end, it feels like it's about time for that game to end. Many Euro games, I prefer to go into the more 90-minute area, but this one really seems great at the 50 to 60-minute end mark, and I've seen that happen pretty much every game I've played. Let's now discuss a couple neutral points, and the first of these has to do with how consequential your early decisions can be to the game, specifically how costly early mistakes can be. Now, I don't think that this can sink your entire game if you make a mistake on turn 1, but it can definitely put you in a behind position that you need to catch up from, and that's because you randomize all the resources on the board at the beginning of every game, and if you don't take 30 seconds at least to digest what the board looks like, then you could really be in trouble. I've played games where I just take my little building marker and I'm like, I'm going to put it right down in the middle of the board. It's close to a whole bunch of building sites. I'm sure that'll be fine. And then like 2 or 3 turns later, I realize I'm nowhere near wood. Like not even close, like 6 or 8 hexagons away. And in the early game, that is humongous because you don't have much of these fog spaces cleared. Now, I've never had it be so bad that you never get that building built because as the game progresses, you are going to be pulling all these fog spaces off, and all the connections will be so large that at the end of the game, you're going to pick something up from one end of the board and move it all the way over to the other. But it means that in those early stages, I've had frustrating moments where both the cards in my hand need wood, and pretty much every building needs wood, and I'm nowhere near wood, and why did I put that there? But fortunately, you can take another building site and plunk it down somewhere else, so this is definitely not a negative to the game. It's something that you need to know going in. This is one of those games you need to analyze the board state, pretty well see also what resource was removed from the game, because one of the resources does not even start on the board, and that can be somewhat significant in how you want to place your starting building sites. If you've only placed one building site and you make that mistake, it's not that big of a deal, but of course, in those situations where I've done this to myself, I've placed 2 or maybe even all 3 of my building sites before I realized my mistake, and that's totally on me, not the game at all, but that's why this is a neutral point. I just wanted to vocalize that this is something you need to pay attention for. And now for neutral number 2, which relates to the buildings that you're going to be building. I guess technically they're called contracts in the game because not all of them are specifically building type things. And in general, I really like this mechanic. It's something that you build towards. It's pretty simplistic with looking at the resources that it costs. It's very easy to see what you need. I kind of like that almost every building in the game doesn't double down on a resource, so you can pretty much always know that taking 2 pigs onto a building site is a bad thing. So you want to try and diversify out. If you don't have any good options, well, take another thing and hopefully you'll work into something. But the reason this is a neutral point is that I feel like the buildings were a bit of a missed opportunity. The actions that happen on the bottom of them, in general, are not that interesting. Many of them are actually kind of boring, and a couple are really cool, but they're in such a minority. Specifically, the cool ones are situational. They give you X number of points at the end of the game based off of how you played the game. Maybe how many adventurers are revealed, or how many exploitation tiles you've taken, that kind of thing. I think there's only 3 or 4 of that type of contract in the game, and I think there's 30-ish contracts total. And I just wish there were more of these situational ones instead of just swap a resource on your building with another one, or just remove a resource from anywhere on the board that you control. You can do good things with these, and it's not like I'm falling asleep when I'm activating that building. Oftentimes I activate that building and I'm happy that I get to do that action. I just wish that in general the buildings were more interesting. It seems like a bit of a miss for the design space, and who knows, maybe this game will do well enough that they'll put out an expansion that has some more interesting, goofy buildings, because I think that the game really could use that when it comes to a long-run replayability. It's now time for me to discuss my one negative for the game, and that relates to the negative points you get for the resources that are out on the board on your craftsman spaces and your building sites when the game is over. Now, I have an interesting perspective on this because I actually completely missed this rule the first 2 times I played the game. For the most part, the rulebook is great, but this one rule is kind of buried in a paragraph that it didn't pop out to me. I really feel like that should have been bolded or put to the side, but either way, I have an interesting perspective because I've played it with and without this rule. When I played without, the last couple turns of the game, especially when it was obvious that a player was not going to be able to build that last building, and they have that building site with resources on it, they more spent their time trying to get their craftsmen out, or like dumping one craftsman spot to get them back and then put it back out on the board to get a couple more points. Because again, getting 1 or 2 points is a pretty big deal in a game where you can easily win with a score of 25. But once I realized that I was playing wrong, and that when you put that craftsman down for your last turn of the game and you take those 1 or 2 points, you're actually giving yourself negative points because you're putting so many resources out on the board, it really changed the end of the game for the players that did not make it to the end. So there's kind of 2 ways to play this game. It's sort of a race. You can try to build cheap buildings quickly and end the game, or you can go for big, fat victory point buildings and kind of know that you're not going to be building 4 of them, or 5 of them, I guess. And I've seen both styles win with and without this rule, but it seems like you are more penalized for going with the slow, big building route with this rule in place. And the reason for that is because near the end of the game, once you know you have 1, 2, maybe 3 turns left, because you can look at the board state and have a pretty good idea when it's about to end, you can find yourself in a position where you just can't get that last building built. And there's already, 2, maybe even 3 resources on there. And I guess if there's 3 resources, it's pretty unlikely you wouldn't be able to build it somehow, but it is possible. And even with 1 or 2 resources, that can be the difference between winning the game and coming in last if it's a really tight game. And I found that players have a hard time figuring out something good to do on their last couple turns. They tend to just dump their meadow tiles down on the board, and hopefully they get to the point where they can get a couple more points from their explorers. And that's a really uninteresting way to end the game. And I feel like having these negative points get loaded on you specifically for the building site, because like I said, sometimes that one building you're going for, somebody takes it and then a new one comes out and it's just, they all require wood, and you're nowhere near wood, and you have all these other resources available to you, but you just cannot cash that out. It seems kind of silly to pretty much lose the game because of that card flip, whereas if somebody bought a building and a new one came out and it just perfectly matched, boom, you built that building and maybe now you win the game. It just seems silly to have it be on a knife's edge like that. I really preferred having the flexibility of different paths that you can go down on that last turn or two. So either way, I'm not sure if I'm going to house rule it going forward. I mean, it almost feels like more just a variant to the game, if you want it to be punishing or not. I guess I will most likely continue to play the game with the rules as they are, but it definitely niggles in the back of my head. I don't really like the way that affects the end game. It feels almost tacked on. I could kind of see why they put it there, but ultimately this is a negative. I feel like it is an extra pressure on somebody going for a more interesting strategy of the big buildings versus just racing with the small buildings to get to the end of the game really quick. And yeah, that pretty much sums up my opinion there. I don't really like it, but I guess I don't actually hate it. Let's now discuss the variability of Via Nebula, and I think that it's in the medium range, although maybe on the slightly low end of that medium. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, you have this deck of contract cards, like I just mentioned in the neutral section, where you have a bunch of different types of contracts, and they're going to come out in different orders each game. But in general, they're not the most interesting contracts in the world. Like the actions that they do on the bottom can be sometimes important and sometimes not actually that important. You're mostly just taking it to get a building to put it out because the resources matched up. So there is a bit of variability there, but it could have definitely been more if we had more buildings or just more different types of things that you could do on those buildings. And then you also have two different maps in the game, which is great. I really enjoy that addition pretty much anytime any board game does that. And in this one, you have a beginner map and an expert map. And the only real difference between the two that I can see is that the building sites are maybe a little bit more spread out, and there are many more of those petrified forest locations on the expert map. And in fact, the first time I ever played the game, we accidentally played on the expert side, and we were definitely feeling it. About halfway through the game, I was like, man, it is difficult to get resources from here to here. And then I looked down and looked at the rulebook and was like, oh, oops, sorry guys. None of us have played before, and we're playing on the hard mode, but we still all enjoyed it, and it really wasn't really that much longer of an experience compared to the other games that I played. So yeah, I think that's why this is a medium amount of variability. You have a couple maps, you have a big stack of contract cards that are going to come out in different ways, but ultimately they don't really drastically affect the overall gameplay of the game. I feel like if the contracts were more interesting, this would be a solid medium variability score for the game. Via Nebula plays 2 to 4 players, and I've played the 3 and 4 player game. I was really hoping to get a 2-player game of this in before I filmed a review, but I don't actually play 2-player games that often in general, and it seemed like I might be waiting indefinitely, and I really wanted to get this review done. So let's go ahead and start with the 2-player. I'm going to talk about how I think it will play. The only real difference between the 2-player game and the 3 and 4-player game is that your building sites are full hexagons. You're never going to be sharing a building site with one of your opponents. That would be a bit weird in a 2-player game because there are only 2 of you. And this makes sense, I think, because in the 3 to 4 player game, if 2 people are on that one site, then they're both going to be trying to get resources to that spot and maybe building fog tiles, clearing fog tiles such that they can get resources over there. If there are 2 players in a 2-player game doing that, it seems a bit silly. So I think you are going to lose out on a bit of that being forced to help your opponents out because you're not trying to get resources to the exact same spot on the board. But that's probably going to be the only main way that this changes. I imagine the board, you will not expand out to the edges quite as much as you do at the other player counts, which might be a bit of a problem. You might be a little bit more locked into the specific resources that are closer to the where both players kind of decide to start. And they're probably going to be somewhat close to each other because you still do want to piggyback off of each other. So I imagine the 2-player experience is okay, but speaking from my experience, I would say that the 4-player game is best and the 3-player game is just fine. The reason I think the 4-player game edges out the 3 is that I really do like how you expand to like pretty much all corners of the board and use most of the resources at the end of a 4-player game. It has a great arc to the game where you just start at the beginning of the game, it's covered in fog, and you're trying to do tiny little things, and at the very end you've just explored every single corner into every single little bit of the board. And in a 3-player game, there's less of that, and there is also well, you're going to be occupying less of these spaces on the board because you're not like hemming the board in at all. But as I said, 3 is fine, 4 is best, and one of the reasons 4 is oftentimes not great in games is gameplay length. But as I mentioned before, even a 4-player game will probably only take about 60 minutes, and it will oftentimes be your turn again faster than you even realize it. So yep, that's how it plays. In conclusion, I've had fun every time I played Via Nebula. This is a neat little package, but not necessarily one that I'm overly excited to continue to play and get to the table. I could see myself keeping this one for a pretty good amount of time, however, because it is a really easy game to teach. And I think it, for me, falls into a gateway style category where I would have no problem teaching this game to people who are not experienced with board games in general. And I think that those people will probably really enjoy it and have a fascinating, really engaging good time because it's just a fun looking game. It's a fun game to experience. The turns are nice and quick. You have good, interesting options that are available to you, and the game is over in about 60 minutes. So that's like all these are perfect things for people who are not very experienced with games because they might not be used to how long board games can sometimes go. And in general, when talking about the game with other people who are experienced with board games, I have played this game with people who are very into board games, who like very long games and go to conventions and all that stuff. And I've still never met anybody who didn't like the game. Maybe some people were not crazy enthusiastic at the end, but everybody has enjoyed it. And I easily see myself playing this game again. Probably not all that often, like I mentioned before. This might be a once every couple months sort of gaming experience, but I do think it is solid mechanically, and I'm not usually crazy about expansions, but man, if this game came out with an expansion that had additional contracts to spice up those options in the buildings, I would probably be much more interested in getting this game to the table. I think that's the biggest thing that kills my overall excitement or enthusiasm about the game is that those buildings are not as interesting as I want them to be, and if they were interesting and they did more kooky wacky things or like chained into each other or just were variable based off the conditioning of the board, I would probably be pushing to play this game even more. But as I said, it's really fun. I've enjoyed every play of it, and I do recommend it. I just think you should know that it's not going to be burning your house down with excitement with people desperately trying to get it to the table, most likely. I'd like to thank everybody who's been supporting my channel through Patreon, including the producer level pledges. If you too would like to directly support this channel, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I would greatly appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching.